Welcome back to Real Estate 101. Today we're going to continue our discussion on family law and talk a little bit about marriage contracts. And I'm pleased to be joined once again by John Schuman of Devery Smith Frank LLP. John, welcome back to the show.
It's great to be back, Joe.
All right, John. So if you think your marriage is in trouble, is there anything you can do to protect yourself and your assets?
There are lots of things you can do, but precisely what works best for you depends on you and your situation and what assets you have. We talked in a previous episode about common family law mistakes that you should avoid, and it'd be good to watch that because there are a lot of mistakes to avoid. And seeing a good family lawyer is often a good thing to do before you start separating, like to plan out what's going to happen and know what you should do and what you should not do. But one of the things that a lot of people can do that works when their marriage is in trouble and can even help save their marriage is to negotiate a marriage contract with their spouse.
Really? So you can sign a marriage contract after you're married?
Yes, in Ontario, you can sign a marriage contract at any time before or after your marriage. In fact, the only time you really can't sign a marriage contract is right before a wedding, when the pressure's on, you've got the invitations out, and you're focused on the wedding rather than on the marriage contract. Other than that, you can sign a marriage contract at any time up until the time you separate. And often that can make a lot of sense when things are there's trouble in the relationship, or there's trouble with the finances in the relationship, and one party needs to insulate themselves from the difficulty their spouse is having. Because as we talked about in another episode, you can share the value of everything, but if one spouse is having real trouble, then a spouse has a choice. Do they separate, or to just protect themselves financially, or do they continue the marriage and suffer the potential financial consequences? But a marriage contract can fix that, and you can set out how things will be divided and protect yourself financially while continuing your marriage.
Right. Okay. So we've discussed protecting yourself when your relationship is coming apart, either using a marriage contract or even a cohabitation agreement. Are there any other times that this would be good, like either one would be good to use?
Well, when you're having trouble with your spouse, then you may want to, take the pressure off of the relationship by having the financial stuff taken away out of the equation. But also, if you've got a spouse who's got gambling problems or is losing money on the stock market, or maybe you're getting a big inheritance and you want to put that into your house, but you don't want necessarily to give all that money or half that money to your spouse, those are all good times to get yourself a marriage contract, because then you can divide up your money the way you think it should be divided up and the way you and your spouse thinks is fair, as opposed to the way the law says is fair.
Right. So
the law says it's fair, or the law says that divided is if your spouse has a gambling problem and blows all your family money, that you share in that loss. And it also says that if you get an inheritance, you put that inheritance into your matrimonial home, then you share in that value with your spouse. But if that's not fair to you, then you can, with your spouse, decide to sign a marriage contract and fix that and do what's best for you and your spouse, and keep your marriage together at the same time.
Okay, so marriage contracts. What can and can't you put in there?
Okay, so you can put into a marriage contract the way you divide your property, sort of what we talked about before. So you can set out exactly how property will be divided when you separate. And that can be completely different from the way the family law would otherwise work. But you can decide one spouse gets everything, or one spouse gets nothing, or that you divide only according to ownership and you don't have any division under the Family Law Act at all. You can completely set it up the way you want it to be. So that can be important for a lot of spouses because they think they want to divide things up the way they think is fair.
Right.
The other thing you can do with a marriage contract is you can set up, decide either what spousal support will be or what spousal support won't be. So you can set up that if you separate after so many years, there will be so much spousal support paid, or you can decide that no matter what happens, that you will never pay spousal support to each other because you've decided that that's fair, that you're both financially independent, no spousal support. So that's
So you can do this ahead of time when you're negotiating the contract.
That's right. And you can do it. You can also do it while you're negotiating the contract before you get married, or you can do it while you're getting married because, your spouse is in trouble and you think, well, an example would be if a spouse decides, I don't want to work so hard anymore. I'm going to stop working at my, $100,000 a year job and work at Tim Hortons. then you can say, well, that's fine, but I don't want to support you. Then you can do a marriage contract to say that there'll be no spousal support in that circumstance. And that's some way, that sort of keeps both spouses happy with the way things are, and also protects the spouse who is, who has the money and doesn't want to end up supporting the spouse who wants to take a break. And you can do that also during your marriage. You can decide who's going to pay for what during your marriage. So, you can have in a marriage contract that one spouse pays the mortgage, the other spouse pays for all the expenses, or however you want to arrange your finances. You can set that up in a marriage contract as well. And those are the most common things to do with a marriage contract, because you can't really, you can do a little bit with regard to raising children, but not much with regard to children, because that's always up to a judge's discretion at the end of the day.
Right.
And some of the things you can't do is you can't opt out of the child support guidelines in a marriage contract. The child support guidelines are basically mandatory. If you want to get out of them, you really need to talk to a lawyer about it. It's not going to be an easy thing to do. Assume that you can't get out of the child support guidelines with your marriage contract. You also can't require someone to leave a matrimonial home in a marriage contract. So if you're going to say, well, if we separate, you have to get out of my house, well, you can't do that. That's one of the things you cannot do. You can say that you, as the owner of the house, get to keep the entire house and all the value in it, but you can't force your spouse out of it. That's another important thing that you can't do. You also cannot require that you and your spouse go to use a method other than court to resolve your differences in a marriage contract. So if you want to decide, like, we don't want to go to court if we have a dispute over things, we want to go to an arbitrator or use another collaborative process or one of the other things, mediator.
Right.
You're absolutely free to do those, but you can't require your spouse to do them in a marriage contract. You can only do that after you separate, require those sorts of processes. And those are the main restrictions on separate or on marriage contracts, what you can and cannot do.
Okay, so are there any rules for spouses when they're doing their marriage contract in order for it to be considered valid? Or can they just wing it and do it however they do it on their own, and whatever they agree to, that's what it is?
Well, there are some rules for marriage contracts, and it is important to follow them if you want the marriage contract to hold up. The basic rules under the Family Law Act are that it has to be in writing, signed, and witnessed. So you can't have an oral marriage contract, and it has to be witnessed. Once you have that and you're dealing with marital property or other issues related to a marriage, you have a marriage contract. But if you want your marriage contract to stand up, the Family Law Act says there's some other things you have to do, because judges can set aside a marriage contract if the parties didn't know what they were talking about, they didn't exchange financial disclosure, or they broke the rules with regard to contracts or under the Divorce Act. So with regard to understanding a contract, both parties have to understand what they're doing when they sign a contract. And there isn't a lot of legalese in marriage contracts, but the wording of marriage contracts has a lot of legal significance because there's been a lot of court decisions about
All
them.
comes down to interpretation, right?
Yeah, and the words that may look like they're simple can have a lot of important legal meaning. And so judges have said basically, if you to make sure you understand a marriage contract, and so there's proof that you understand a marriage contract, you have to speak to a lawyer, you have to get independent legal advice. And judges are reluctant to ever uphold a marriage contract that does not have a certificate of independent legal advice for both parties attached to the marriage contract. So you really do have to see lawyers to get a marriage contract. The second is you have to exchange financial disclosure, and you have to exchange full financial disclosure of your income and your assets and liabilities. And if that's part of understanding the marriage contract, because you don't know what the other spouse has, you don't know what you're giving up. And if you don't have exchange financial disclosure, then your judge is not going to respect your marriage contract. It'll just get thrown out. It's like you never had one. So when you have a marriage contract, you really want to also have a sort of formal exchange of disclosure, so you can actually point to like a usual booklet or a group of documents and say, this is exactly what they got when they signed the marriage contract. Look, my spouse knew everything. There's no reason to set it aside. And that protects you and protects the marriage contract, so you're sure it stands up.
Right. So you've got a bunch of stuff to substantiate what was done.
That's right. You can't just rely on saying my spouse knew everything. Like
Right.
had access to my bank accounts. I showed him or her everything before we got married, and they just knew. You can't rely on that. You really do need to have something that you gave to them and you can show to a judge later. Say this is what they saw, because otherwise the judges say, yeah, right. Maybe you think they knew everything, but they didn't really ever know everything.
Right.
So you need that to show them. And the third thing is that you have to follow the law, and you can't break the law of contract. That's if you have a lawyer working for you, that's going to be difficult to do because the laws of contract means you're not going to have any undue influence or duress or pressure, and you're not going to contract over things that you don't own or involve or bind third parties who are not a party to the contract. Those are sort of basic rules of contract. You're not going to break those rules if you have a lawyer. You also have to have in marriage contracts, because you're supposed to love each other and be wanting to think about each other.
Right.
You also have to have an equal balancing of power, and you don't have one spouse trying to screw over the other with the marriage contract, because that's, they're called contracts of utmost good faith, which means fiancés, and when they're going to be married, are supposed to be looking out for each other's best interests, not trying to stab them in the back.
Right.
So if you're trying to stab your spouse in the back, your contract may not stand up.
Right. Right.
And lastly, you have to, when you're in a marriage contract, you have to really think about the future and what your life's going to look like together down the road. And you have to contemplate your marriage. You can't just be thinking about the present. You have to be thinking about what happens in the future if we have kids, if I lose my job, if I become really sick and I'm unable to work anymore, if we win the lottery. All of those sorts of things you have to think about when doing a marriage contract. And again, if you speak to a lawyer, the lawyer will talk to you about all those things to make sure you've thought about them, and will put language into the marriage contract that says you thought about them. Those sort of close off all the doors for a judge to set aside the marriage contract and leave you with nothing to protect yourself.
Okay. Now, if I recall correctly, you had mentioned in a previous episode that one thing you can't do in a marriage contract is anything that has to do with child custody, right?
That's right. Child custody and child access, anything regarding the parenting of a child, those are always up to a judge at the end. So you can sort of include them, but always the best interest of the child trumps all of that. So a judge is going to give no attention to your marriage contract, what your marriage contract says, or even what a separation agreement really says if there's a big dispute over it. A judge is always going to do what's in the best interest of the child.
Okay, so I guess you've already answered this in a sense, but are all contracts guaranteed to hold up?
You can't really guarantee a contract's going to hold up, because if you have a situation you weren't considering down the road, or there was a problem with financial disclosure, or someone hid something, if you follow the rules I set out, then the contract should stand up. But if you deviate from those rules a little bit or too much, then you might get into trouble. And you never know, if you deviate from the rules a little bit, what your spouse, who's then your ex-spouse, is going to say. If I had only known that one thing, if we only done this one thing, I would never have signed the contract.
Well, of course, right?
So if you go away from the rules at all, you're taking a risk. And even then, if it looks like you went away from the rules, you're taking a risk. But generally, if you follow the rules, the Supreme Court has said parties should be kept to their bargain, even in family law matters. And so follow these rules, and your marriage contract should stand up.
All right. So how common are marriage contracts right now?
They're more common than you would think. I mean, we do in my office, probably 100 or so a year. So, and we're only one office. They're not uncommon. They're particularly common when you have one person who's bringing a lot of money into a marriage and doesn't want us to protect that, or has a house that they're bringing into a marriage. They want to make sure they don't lose half as the matrimonial home.
Or a family cottage, which we talked about last month.
That's right. The family cottage is another big issue. You can protect that with a marriage contract. You also have the situations where you've got people who come in and they say, my spouse, they're not doing so well. They've either lost their job or they're gambling, or they've got drug addiction problems, and I just can't trust them anymore financially. And I still love them and I want to help them, but I can't take the risk. And so I think I have to separate. And that's when we as family law lawyers say, well, you don't have to separate if you do a marriage contract and your spouse agrees to sign it. So if you follow the steps and do the marriage contract, and even if you have difficult situations, you can protect yourself and save your marriage at the same time.
Okay, now I know we've discussed this in a previous episode, but for viewers and listeners that maybe haven't watched it yet, marriage contracts are for people that are getting married. Now, what happens if you're going to be living with somebody common law? You can't really use a marriage contract for that.
You can't have a marriage contract if you're not married, but you can have a cohabitation agreement.
Right.
Cohabitation agreement is essentially the same thing, except that it's for people who are living together. And the rules for, like we talked about in another episode, there's common law couples don't share each other's property or the value to their property under the Family Law Act at all. So you don't need to deal with that in a cohabitation agreement. But you may have to deal with other things that are particular to your cohabitation, how you're arranging your finances or how you're arranging the ownership of your affairs. And you still have to deal with support, because if you're common law, you still have support obligations to each other. And you may have a tax from your now ex-spouse saying that really something was owned by them instead of you if it's not clear. So you can really set out and protect yourself with if you're cohabitating with someone with a cohabitation agreement. And if you do have some money or some wealth or things you need to protect when before you move into someone, you should speak to a lawyer to find out what your risks are and whether you need a contract before you actually let them move into your place or you move into theirs.
Okay, John. So for viewers and listeners of our show that are thinking about getting a marriage contract or a cohabitation agreement done, how can they get in contact with you?
Well, they can call me at 416-446-5080. They can reach me through my website at devrylaw.ca. They can also follow me on Twitter, which is @SchumanFamLaw, or they can follow my Facebook page.
All right, John. Thanks for coming on today's show.
Thanks for having me back, Joe.
So there you have it. If you're looking for a top family lawyer, get in contact with John Schuman of Devry Smith Frank, LLP. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, comment, like, and share our videos. I'm Joe. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.